Picture this: a continent that has witnessed the rise and fall of ice ages, the birth of mountain ranges, and the slow dance of evolution across tens of thousands of years. A land where the oldest continuous culture on Earth has thrived, adapted, and flourished through changes that would humble any civilization. This is the story of Aboriginal Australia, a tale so ancient and profound that it stretches back to the very dawn of human consciousness itself. What you're about to hear isn't just history. It's the longest unbroken story ever told by humanity. While other civilizations rose and crumbled to dust, while empires conquered and collapsed, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia maintained their connection to country, their Dreamtime stories, and their sacred traditions across an almost incomprehensible span of time. We're talking about a culture that was already ancient when the pyramids were built, already sophisticated when Rome was just a collection of hills beside the Tiber River. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you'll journey through 65,000 years of human experience. You'll walk alongside the first people to set foot on this vast southern continent. Witness their incredible adaptations to environments that ranged from tropical rainforests to scorching deserts, and discover how they developed one of the world's most complex spiritual and social systems. This isn't just a bedtime story. This is the epic of human resilience, ingenuity, and connection to the natural world, told on a scale that dwarfs anything else in human experience. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. It's not just ancient history gathering dust in academic journals. This is a living narrative that continues today, connecting modern Aboriginal communities to their ancestors through an unbroken chain of knowledge, ceremony, and cultural practice that spans more generations than any other human society has ever achieved. The Dreamtime stories you'll hear tonight are the same ones that have been shared around campfires for thousands upon thousands of years, passed down through initiation ceremonies, sacred sites, and the careful guardianship of elders who understood that they were the custodians of humanity's oldest memories. As we begin this journey together, imagine the Australia of 65,000 years ago. The continent was larger then, connected to New Guinea by land bridges that would later disappear beneath rising seas. Massive marsupials roamed the landscape, creatures so enormous they would seem mythical today. Diprotodon, wombat-like giants the size of small cars, grazed in herds across vast grasslands. Megalania, monitor lizards over 20 feet long, stalked prey through forests that stretched beyond the horizon. This was a world where the very geography was different, where inland seas sparkled under ancient skies, and where the ancestors of today's Aboriginal peoples would write the first chapter of Australian human history. The story begins not in Australia itself, but in the islands and coastal regions of Southeast Asia, where anatomically modern humans had been developing the seafaring skills that would make one of history's most remarkable journeys possible. These weren't primitive wanderers stumbling accidentally onto a new continent. They were sophisticated navigators who looked across stretches of open ocean and made a conscious decision to explore what lay beyond the horizon. Even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, reaching Australia required crossing at least 90 kilometers of open water, a journey that demanded advanced boat-building technology, navigation skills, and the kind of coordinated planning that speaks to complex social organization. The exact details of that first crossing remain one of archaeology's most intriguing mysteries. Did they island hop through the Indonesian archipelago, using the chain of volcanic peaks as stepping stones across the deep waters? Did they follow coastal currents, reading the subtle signs of wind and wave that experienced mariners learned to interpret? What's certain is that they succeeded, and in doing so, they became the first humans to make a deliberate ocean crossing to reach a previously uninhabited continent. This wasn't just migration, it was exploration on an epic scale, the kind of bold venture that would define the human spirit for millennia to come. When those first boats touched the shores of northern Australia, their occupants stepped onto a continent unlike anywhere humans had ever lived. This was a land of extremes, from the tropical abundance of the north to the arid heart of the continent, from coastal mangrove swamps to mountain ranges that scraped the sky. It was a continent populated by creatures that evolution had crafted in isolation for millions of years, marsupials and monotremes that would have seemed alien to people familiar with the placental mammals of Asia and Africa. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. Not only did these first Australians survive in this new environment, they thrived. Within just a few thousand years, they had spread across the entire continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from the fertile east coast to the challenging deserts of the interior. They developed technologies perfectly adapted to each environment, created social systems that could coordinate resource use across vast territories, and established spiritual connections to landscapes that would endure for thousands of generations. The speed of this continental colonization tells us something profound about these early Australians. They weren't just survivors, they were innovators, problem solvers who could read the subtle signs of a new environment and adapt their lifestyles accordingly. In the tropical north, they developed sophisticated fish traps and seasonal burning practices that encouraged the growth of useful plants. In the arid interior, they memorized the locations of hidden water sources and developed navigation techniques that could guide them across seemingly featureless landscapes. Along the coasts, they became master marine hunters, developing spear throwers, fish hooks, and watercraft perfectly suited to their local conditions. Each group that settled in a particular region began the long process of developing intimate knowledge of their new home. They learned the seasonal patterns of animals and plants, the location of every water source, the properties of different stones for tool making, the medicinal qualities of local plants. This wasn't just practical knowledge. It was the beginning of a spiritual relationship with the landscape that would become one of the defining characteristics of Aboriginal culture. The Dreamtime, that complex Aboriginal understanding of creation, spirituality, and law, began to take shape during these early millennia. As different groups established themselves in their chosen territories, they developed creation stories that explained the formation of local landmarks, the behavior of local animals, and the proper relationships between people and their environment. These weren't just stories. They were sophisticated systems of knowledge that encoded practical information about survival, social relationships, and environmental management in memorable narrative form. Picture a group of early Australians camping beside a waterhole in what would later become the heart of the continent. The elders are sharing stories with the younger members of their group, stories that explain why this particular waterhole never runs dry, which animals come to drink here during different seasons, and what ceremonies must be performed to maintain the spiritual balance that keeps the water flowing. These stories become the foundation of law, science, and spirituality, all woven together in a seamless understanding of how the world works. As generations passed, these local knowledge systems became increasingly sophisticated. Groups developed detailed classification systems for plants and animals that would impress modern biologists with their accuracy and completeness. They created seasonal calendars that tracked not just obvious changes like temperature and rainfall, but subtle variations in wind patterns, insect behavior, and plant flowering that indicated the best times for different activities. They established trade networks that moved valuable materials like ochre, special stones for tools, and ceremonial objects across thousands of kilometers of challenging terrain. The development of Aboriginal technology during these early millennia reveals a deep understanding of materials and their properties. They created the world's most sophisticated stone tool technologies, developing techniques for heat treatment that could improve the quality of stone, hafting methods that created composite tools of remarkable efficiency, and specialized implements for every conceivable task. The boomerang, perhaps the most famous Aboriginal invention, represents just one example of their engineering brilliance. Different types of boomerangs served different purposes: hunting sticks for bringing down game, returning boomerangs for sport and ceremony, and fighting sticks for warfare. Each design represented thousands of years of refinement and testing. But technology was never separate from spirituality in Aboriginal culture. The creation of tools, the hunting of animals, the gathering of plants, all these activities were embedded in ceremonial practices that acknowledged the spiritual relationships between people and the natural world. A hunter didn't just track and kill an animal. He performed rituals that honored the animal's spirit and ensured that the species would continue to thrive. A woman gathering plants didn't simply take what she needed. She followed protocols that ensured the continued health of the plant communities and maintained her spiritual connection to the country. This integration of practical knowledge with spiritual understanding created one of the world's most sustainable ways of life. For thousands of years, Aboriginal peoples lived in environments that could easily have been degraded by overhunting, overuse of resources, or inappropriate land management. Instead, they developed practices that actually enhanced the productivity and diversity of their environments. Their use of fire, for example, wasn't just a tool for hunting or clearing land. It was a sophisticated landscape management technique that increased biodiversity, reduced the risk of catastrophic wildfires, and created the complex mosaic of different vegetation types that characterized the Australian landscape when Europeans first arrived. The social systems that developed during these early millennia were equally sophisticated. Aboriginal society was organized around complex kinship systems that determined marriage partners, ceremonial roles, and resource rights across vast territories. These weren't simple family relationships. They were intricate networks that connected individuals to hundreds of other people across multiple generations and geographical regions. A person's position in this kinship system determined not just who they could marry, but which ceremonies they could participate in, which sacred sites they could visit, and which knowledge they were entitled to receive. These kinship systems served multiple functions. They prevented inbreeding in small populations. They created networks of mutual obligation that provided security during difficult times, and they established clear protocols for resolving disputes and sharing resources. They also created the social framework for one of humanity's most sophisticated oral traditions, systems of knowledge transmission that could preserve detailed information across hundreds of generations without any form of writing. As you listen to this story unfold, consider the magnitude of what these early Australians achieved. In the span of just a few thousand years, they had not only colonized an entire continent, but had developed sustainable relationships with dozens of different environments, created technologies perfectly adapted to their needs, established social systems that could maintain stability across vast territories, and begun the development of spiritual traditions that would guide their descendants for thousands of generations to come. The Australia they created was not an empty wilderness waiting for civilization to arrive. It was a continent managed by people who understood its rhythms and seasons, who had shaped its landscapes through careful burning and selective harvesting, who had established trade routes that connected desert communities with coastal peoples, mountain dwellers with river folk. Every waterhole, every mountain, every stretch of coastline had its human story, its place in the complex web of relationships that connected people to country and to each other. This was the foundation upon which one of the world's most remarkable civilizations would build and flourish. As the millennia rolled by, these early communities didn't simply survive in their chosen territories, they transformed them. The relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Australian landscape became so intimate, so finely tuned, that the continent itself began to bear the stamp of human influence in ways that would remain invisible to later European observers, who mistook careful management for pristine wilderness. The development of what anthropologists call the dreaming represents perhaps humanity's most sophisticated integration of practical knowledge, spiritual belief, and environmental science. This wasn't a religion in the way we might understand the term today. With its separation between sacred and secular, between the spiritual and the everyday, the dreaming was a complete worldview that explained everything from the creation of mountains and rivers to the proper way to prepare food, from the movements of celestial bodies to the intricate protocols governing marriage and social relationships. Imagine sitting around a campfire 40,000 years ago, listening to an elder describe how the great rainbow serpent carved the rivers and valleys as it moved across the landscape during the creation time. This isn't just a story. It's a geological lesson that encodes information about where to find water during dry seasons, which valleys offer the best shelter during storms, and how the landscape continues to change over time. The rainbow serpent's journey becomes a map, a weather forecast, and a spiritual teaching all woven together in a narrative so compelling that it would be remembered and retold for countless generations. As different groups established themselves across the continent, these Dreamtime stories began to create an invisible network of connections that linked distant communities together. A particular ancestor spirit might begin its creative journey in the tropical north, travel through the central deserts, and complete its story in the temperate south. Communities along this spiritual pathway became connected through shared ceremonies, similar artistic traditions, and mutual obligations to maintain the sacred sites that marked the ancestors' passage. These songlines, as they came to be known, created highways of meaning that crisscrossed the entire continent. A person could theoretically walk from one end of Australia to the other, navigating entirely by the landmarks and stories embedded in these sacred songs. The practical knowledge of where to find water, food, and shelter was inseparable from the spiritual knowledge of which ceremonies to perform, which taboos to observe, and how to maintain proper relationships with the spiritual forces that inhabited the landscape. The sophistication of this system becomes apparent when you consider the challenges it addressed. Australia is a continent of extreme variability, where resources can be abundant one year and scarce the next, where water sources may flow reliably for decades and then suddenly fail during extended droughts. The Aboriginal response to this unpredictability wasn't to try to control the environment through agriculture or permanent settlements, but to develop social and spiritual systems flexible enough to adapt to any conditions while maintaining the essential knowledge needed for survival. During times of plenty, communities could come together for elaborate ceremonies that might last for weeks or months. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They were opportunities for young people to be initiated into adult responsibilities, for marriages to be arranged between distant groups, for trade goods to be exchanged, and for the complex body of traditional knowledge to be passed from elders to the next generation. The ceremonies themselves were multimedia experiences that combined music, dance, visual art, storytelling, and dramatic performance to create unforgettable learning experiences. The artistic traditions that developed during these gatherings represent some of humanity's oldest continuous creative expressions. Rock art sites across Australia contain paintings and engravings that span tens of thousands of years, creating galleries of human expression that dwarf anything found elsewhere in the world. These aren't just decorative images, they're libraries of information that record everything from hunting techniques and animal behavior to astronomical observations and ceremonial protocols. The famous rock art of Kakadu National Park, for example, tells the story of environmental change over thousands of years. The oldest paintings show animals that became extinct at the end of the Ice Age, while more recent works document the arrival of new species and changes in sea level. The X-ray style paintings that show the internal organs of animals aren't just artistic choices. They're anatomical diagrams that teach proper butchering techniques and encode knowledge about which parts of different animals are safe to eat during various seasons. As these artistic traditions developed, they became increasingly sophisticated in their symbolic content. Abstract patterns that might appear purely decorative to outsiders actually represent complex information about kinship relationships, territorial boundaries, and ceremonial obligations. The ability to read these symbols correctly was a mark of initiation and adult status, creating layers of meaning that ensured sacred knowledge remained protected while still being transmitted to appropriate recipients. The tool-making traditions that developed during this period reveal an equally impressive mastery of materials and techniques. Aboriginal Australians became the world's experts at working with the unique stones available on their continent, developing techniques for creating tools that were not just functional, but were often works of art in their own right. The pressure flaking techniques used to create the finest stone knives and spear points required years of training to master and produced edges sharper than modern surgical steel. But perhaps most remarkably, they also developed what may be the world's first composite technologies, creating tools that combined multiple materials to achieve properties that no single substance could provide. Spear throwers increased the power and accuracy of hunting weapons, while hafted axes and adzes allowed for more efficient woodworking and food processing. The development of plant-based adhesives and binding techniques made it possible to create tools that could be repaired and maintained over long periods, reducing waste and increasing efficiency. The mastery of fire that Aboriginal peoples achieved during this period transformed not just their own lives, but the entire Australian ecosystem. They developed burning techniques so sophisticated that they could control exactly which plants would regenerate after a fire, which areas would become grassland, and which would remain forest, and how to create the complex mosaic of different vegetation types that maximized biodiversity and resource availability. This wasn't the random or destructive use of fire that Europeans would later assume. It was precision landscape management that required intimate knowledge of plant ecology, animal behavior, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles. Different areas would be burned at different times of year and at different intervals, creating a patchwork of vegetation at various stages of regeneration. This system not only prevented the catastrophic wildfires that could devastate large areas, but actually increased the carrying capacity of the land for both wildlife and human populations. The social implications of this fire management system were profound. The knowledge of when and where to burn required coordination between different groups across vast territories. The timing of burns had to consider not just local conditions, but the needs of neighboring communities who might depend on particular resources at certain times of year. This created networks of communication and cooperation that linked communities across the continent in systems of mutual dependence and shared responsibility. Women's roles in these early societies were particularly important in the development of plant knowledge and food processing techniques. While men often specialized in hunting large game and maintaining the spiritual responsibilities associated with particular totemic animals, Women became the experts in the botanical resources that actually provided the majority of the calories in most Aboriginal diets. They developed techniques for processing toxic plants to make them edible, for grinding seeds and roots into nutritious flours, and for preserving foods to last through seasonal shortages. The digging sticks, grinding stones, and carrying vessels that women used and maintained represented some of the most sophisticated food processing technologies in the world. The techniques for leaching tannins from acorns, for extracting starch from cycad nuts, and for preparing the dozens of different seeds, roots, and tubers that formed the backbone of the Aboriginal diet, required chemical knowledge that wouldn't be understood by Western science until the 20th century. These gender-based specializations weren't rigid hierarchies, but complementary systems that recognized the different but equally important contributions that men and women made to community survival. The knowledge that women possessed about plant resources was considered just as sacred and important as the hunting and ceremonial knowledge that men maintained. Both were essential for the proper functioning of Aboriginal society, and both were protected and transmitted through equally complex systems of initiation and instruction. As these early communities matured and their knowledge systems became more sophisticated, they began to develop what may have been the world's first sustainable population management strategies. Through a combination of social practices, ceremonial obligations, and environmental management techniques, they maintained population levels that remained in balance with available resources for thousands of years. This wasn't achieved through conflict or competition, but through cultural mechanisms that encouraged cooperation and resource sharing. The complex marriage rules that required people to find partners from distant groups created networks of kinship that spread across vast territories, ensuring that resources could be shared between communities during times of scarcity. The ceremonial obligations that required groups to come together at certain times and places created opportunities for population redistribution that prevented any one area from becoming overused. The spiritual beliefs that governed hunting and gathering activities included built-in conservation measures that ensured the sustainability of important resources. Certain animals could only be hunted at particular times of year or by people of specific ceremonial status. Important plant resources were protected by taboos that limited when and how much could be harvested. Sacred sites often coincided with critical resource areas, creating protected zones that served as refuges for both wildlife and plant communities. These conservation practices weren't imposed by distant authorities, but grew organically from thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. Each generation learned from the successes and mistakes of their predecessors, gradually refining their understanding of how to live in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world. The elders who guided these communities weren't just repositories of ancient wisdom, but active researchers who continued to observe, test, and adapt their knowledge to changing conditions. The development of seasonal calendars during this period represents one of humanity's most sophisticated attempts to understand and predict natural cycles. Unlike the solar and lunar calendars developed by agricultural societies, Aboriginal seasonal systems were based on detailed observations of ecological indicators that varied from region to region. In the tropical north, the arrival of certain flowering plants might signal the beginning of the wet season and the time to move to higher ground. In the central deserts, the behavior of particular insects might indicate when underground water sources would be most accessible. These calendars weren't simple lists of when to do certain activities, but complex systems that integrated astronomical observations with ecological knowledge, weather patterns with spiritual obligations. The appearance of certain stars in the night sky might coincide with the breeding season of important animals, the flowering of crucial food plants, and the appropriate time for particular ceremonies. This integration of celestial and terrestrial phenomena created a sophisticated understanding of time that encompassed not just practical activities, but the spiritual and social rhythms that gave meaning to Aboriginal life. The navigation techniques that developed during this period allowed Aboriginal peoples to travel confidently across landscapes that would challenge even modern explorers equipped with maps and GPS technology. In the featureless expanses of the central deserts, navigators learned to read subtle changes in vegetation, rock formations, and even the patterns of sand dunes to determine their location and direction of travel. They memorized the positions of water sources, separated by hundreds of kilometers of arid terrain, creating mental maps of extraordinary accuracy and detail. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed techniques for navigating by the stars that were perfectly adapted to the Southern Hemisphere's unique celestial features. The Southern Cross, the Coal Sack Nebula, and the Magellanic Clouds became landmarks in the night sky that could guide travelers across vast distances. Different groups developed their own astronomical traditions, but all shared a sophisticated understanding of how celestial movements correlated with seasonal changes and navigation requirements. The oral traditions that preserve this knowledge represent one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. Without any form of writing, Aboriginal cultures developed memory techniques that could preserve detailed information across hundreds of generations with remarkable accuracy. Stories, songs, and ceremonies were structured in ways that made them virtually impossible to forget. Using rhythm, rhyme, visual imagery, and emotional content to embed information in forms that would resist corruption over time. The training required to become a keeper of this knowledge was extraordinarily rigorous. Young people selected for these roles would spend years learning not just the content of traditional stories, but the precise ways they had to be told, the specific contexts in which different versions were appropriate, and the subtle variations that encoded different levels of meaning. The responsibility of maintaining this knowledge was so great that many traditional owners speak of feeling the weight of thousands of ancestors watching over their shoulders, ensuring that nothing important was lost or changed. As these oral traditions matured, they began to encode increasingly sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena. Creation stories that seemed to be purely mythological to early European observers actually contained detailed information about geological processes, climate patterns, and ecological relationships. The story of how particular landscape features were formed during the Dreamtime often provided accurate accounts of geological events that occurred thousands of years before the ancestors of current Aboriginal peoples arrived in an area. This integration of practical knowledge with spiritual understanding created a worldview that was both deeply respectful of natural forces and highly effective at predicting and responding to environmental changes. Aboriginal peoples developed what modern scientists would recognize as sophisticated hypotheses about cause and effect relationships in natural systems. But they expressed these insights through narrative forms that were more memorable and emotionally engaging than abstract scientific formulations. The trading networks that developed during this period created connections between communities separated by vast distances and dramatically different environments. Ochre from the central deserts might travel to coastal communities, where it would be exchanged for shells that would then make their way to mountain regions, where they would be traded for special stones used in toolmaking. These weren't simple barter systems, but complex networks of reciprocal obligation that created lasting relationships between distant groups. The items that moved along these trade routes weren't just practical goods, but objects of spiritual and ceremonial significance. Sacred stones from particular quarries might be required for certain rituals, while shells from specific beaches held special meaning in creation stories. The act of trading wasn't just economic, but ceremonial. creating opportunities for the exchange of knowledge, the arrangement of marriages, and the maintenance of the social bonds that linked Aboriginal communities across the continent. These trade networks also served as communication systems that could spread important information across vast distances with remarkable speed. News of environmental changes, the discovery of new resources, or the development of new technologies could travel from one end of the continent to the other through the networks of traders and travelers who moved along established routes. This created a form of continental-scale intelligence network that helped Aboriginal communities adapt to changing conditions and learn from each other's innovations. The artistic traditions that flourished during this period weren't separate from these practical concerns, but were deeply integrated with systems of knowledge transmission and social organization. The rock art galleries that were created at important gathering places served multiple functions simultaneously. They were libraries that preserved important information about hunting techniques, seasonal patterns, and ceremonial obligations. They were also galleries where artists could display their skills and innovation, pushing the boundaries of traditional forms while maintaining connection to ancestral knowledge. The development of different regional art styles during this period reflects the increasing sophistication of local cultural traditions while maintaining connections to broader continental patterns. The distinctive X-ray art of Arnhem Land, the dynamic figures of the Kimberley, and the geometric patterns of the central deserts all represented unique artistic innovations that emerged from particular environmental and social conditions. Yet these diverse traditions shared underlying structural similarities that revealed their common origins and ongoing connections. The techniques developed for creating these artworks were themselves remarkable achievements. Aboriginal artists developed pigments that could maintain their colors for thousands of years in challenging environmental conditions. They created brushes and application techniques that allowed for extraordinary precision and detail. They developed methods for preparing rock surfaces that would accept paint reliably and for creating images that would remain visible and meaningful across countless generations. But perhaps most importantly, they developed artistic conventions that could encode multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. A single image might tell a creation story, provide a map of local resources, encode kinship relationships, and serve as a mnemonic device for remembering ceremonial obligations. The ability to read these multiple meanings correctly was a mark of cultural sophistication that required years of training and initiation to achieve. The weapons and hunting technologies that developed during this period demonstrate an equally impressive mastery of physics and engineering principles. The spear thrower, or woomera, represents one of humanity's first mechanical devices for amplifying human physical capabilities. By effectively extending the length of the thrower's arm, it could double or triple the velocity and accuracy of thrown spears. Different designs were optimized for different types of hunting, from the heavy versions used for large game to the delicate models designed for hunting birds and small animals. The development of the boomerang represents perhaps the pinnacle of Aboriginal engineering achievement. The aerodynamic principles that allow a returning boomerang to fly in a curved path and return to the thrower weren't understood by Western science until the 20th century. Yet Aboriginal craftsmen had been perfecting these designs for thousands of years. The non-returning hunting sticks were equally sophisticated, designed to maintain accuracy and striking power over long distances while being robust enough to bring down large prey. Fish traps and nets developed during this period show similar sophistication in their understanding of animal behavior and water dynamics. The massive stone fish traps built in rivers and coastal areas could channel fish into holding areas where they could be easily harvested, while the complex nets used in different environments were perfectly adapted to local conditions and target species. These technologies allowed Aboriginal peoples to harvest aquatic resources sustainably while minimizing the effort required. The food processing techniques that developed during this period transformed many toxic or inedible plants into nutritious staples that could support large populations. The process for preparing cycad nuts, for example, required removing deadly toxins through a complex series of grinding, leaching, and fermentation steps that took weeks to complete. The knowledge of how to do this safely was carefully guarded and transmitted through formal instruction, as mistakes could be fatal. Similarly, the techniques for preparing various seeds, roots, and tubers required sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry and nutrition. Aboriginal women developed methods for maximizing the nutritional value of foods while removing harmful compounds, creating dietary systems that provided complete nutrition from locally available resources. These techniques were so effective that many Aboriginal communities maintained better nutritional status than European settlers, who had access to imported foods and agricultural products. The social structures that had evolved to support these complex knowledge systems were equally sophisticated. The kinship systems that governed Aboriginal society weren't just family relationships, but intricate networks that determined every aspect of social interaction. A person's position in these systems determined not just who they could marry, but which ceremonies they could attend, which knowledge they could access, and which responsibilities they would inherit. These kinship systems served multiple functions that were essential for the survival and prosperity of Aboriginal communities. They prevented inbreeding in relatively small populations by ensuring that marriage partners came from genetically diverse backgrounds. They created networks of mutual obligation that provided security during difficult times, ensuring that no individual or family would face hardship alone. They established clear protocols for resolving disputes and sharing resources, preventing conflicts that could destroy community cohesion. Perhaps most importantly, these kinship systems created the social framework for transmitting the vast body of traditional knowledge that was essential for survival in the Australian environment. Different aspects of this knowledge were associated with different kinship positions, creating a distributed storage system that ensured important information wouldn't be lost if particular individuals died unexpectedly. The complexity of these systems required that every person understand not just their own position, but the relationships between all other members of their community, creating a sophisticated form of social intelligence. The ceremonial life that developed around these kinship systems created some of humanity's most elaborate ritual performances. Initiation ceremonies that marked the transition from childhood to adult status could last for months and involve participants from communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. These weren't just symbolic events, but intensive educational experiences that transmitted the knowledge and responsibilities associated with adult membership in Aboriginal society. The complexity and beauty of these ceremonies impressed even the most ethnocentric European observers. Participants would paint their bodies with intricate designs that encoded information about their kinship relationships, spiritual obligations, and ceremonial roles. They would perform dances that recreated creation stories, demonstrated hunting techniques, and reinforced social bonds. They would sing songs that preserved historical events, ecological knowledge, and spiritual teachings in forms that were both artistically satisfying and practically useful. These ceremonies also served as forums for innovation and adaptation within traditional frameworks. While the basic structures and meanings of important rituals were carefully preserved, there was always room for individual creativity and interpretation. Skilled performers could add new elements, modify existing patterns, or create variations that reflected changing circumstances while maintaining connection to ancestral traditions. The leadership structures that governed these ceremonial activities represented sophisticated forms of democratic decision-making that ensured community consensus while respecting traditional authority. Elders who had demonstrated their knowledge and wisdom over many years provided guidance and direction. But important decisions were made through extended discussion and consultation that included all adult members of the community. These processes could take days or weeks to complete, but they ensured that major changes had broad support and wouldn't create lasting divisions within the group. As tens of thousands of years passed, these various systems of knowledge, technology, social organization, and spiritual practice became increasingly integrated and sophisticated. What emerged was not just a successful adaptation to the Australian environment, but one of humanity's most complete and sustainable civilizations. Aboriginal peoples had created ways of life that could maintain themselves indefinitely without depleting the resources on which they depended or degrading the environments in which they lived. This achievement becomes even more remarkable when considered against the backdrop of environmental challenges that Aboriginal peoples faced during this period. The end of the last ice age brought dramatic changes to the Australian landscape as sea levels rose. Inland lakes dried up, and vegetation patterns shifted across the continent. Many of the large animals that had characterized the Pleistocene landscape became extinct, forcing Aboriginal communities to adapt their hunting strategies and find new sources of food. Rather than simply surviving these changes, Aboriginal peoples turned them into opportunities for cultural and technological innovation. As coastlines stabilized at their current levels, coastal communities developed increasingly sophisticated marine technologies and established permanent settlements near reliable resources. As inland environments became more arid, desert peoples perfected the techniques for finding and conserving water that would allow them to thrive in some of the world's most challenging environments. The spiritual frameworks that had developed to make sense of these changes provided both practical guidance and emotional support during periods of uncertainty and loss. The Dreamtime stories that explained how the landscape had been formed during the creation period also provided templates for understanding and adapting to ongoing environmental changes. If the ancestors had faced similar challenges during the Dreamtime, their descendants could draw on their example and guidance to find appropriate responses to contemporary problems. This integration of practical adaptation with spiritual understanding created a uniquely resilient form of civilization that could bend without breaking, evolve without losing its essential character. As the great ice sheets retreated and the world entered the climatic patterns we know today, Aboriginal Australia had already established the cultural foundations that would carry it through whatever changes might come. The sophistication of their environmental management became even more apparent as post-glacial Australia took its modern form. Where other societies might have seen empty wilderness, Aboriginal peoples recognized intricate webs of relationship and opportunity. Every landscape feature had its story, its seasonal rhythms, its place in the larger patterns of resource availability and spiritual significance. Mountains weren't just geological formations, but the bodies of ancestral beings whose dreams continued to influence weather patterns and water flow. Rivers weren't just sources of water, but the tracks of creation serpents whose movements had carved the valleys and established the laws governing fishing rights and ceremonial obligations. This deep reading of landscape allowed Aboriginal communities to predict and prepare for environmental variations that might seem random or catastrophic to outside observers. The subtle signs that preceded drought years, the indicators that suggested when particular food sources would be abundant or scarce, the warnings that certain areas were becoming unstable or dangerous. All of this information was encoded in traditional knowledge systems that could guide community decision-making across multiple generations. The seasonal movements that characterized many Aboriginal groups weren't random wandering, but carefully orchestrated journeys that maximized resource access while minimizing environmental impact. A community might follow a circuit that took them through a dozen different environments over the course of a year, arriving at each location precisely when particular resources were at their peak availability. These movements were timed to coincide with the breeding seasons of important animals, the flowering and fruiting cycles of crucial plants, and the seasonal availability of water sources. But these weren't just practical migrations. Each stage of the seasonal round was associated with particular ceremonies, social activities, and knowledge transmission events that could only occur at specific times and places. The journey itself became a form of education, as younger community members learned to read the subtle environmental cues that indicated when it was time to move on, which direction to travel, and what to expect at their next destination. The camps established during these seasonal rounds weren't temporary shelters, but carefully designed living spaces that reflected thousands of years of experimentation and refinement. Aboriginal peoples developed construction techniques perfectly adapted to local conditions and available materials. In the tropical north, they created structures that could withstand cyclonic winds and monsoon rains while providing ventilation during hot, humid periods. In the arid interior, they built shelters that offered protection from extreme temperature variations while requiring minimal materials and labor to construct. These architectural traditions weren't just functional, but were embedded with cultural meaning and social significance. The arrangement of family shelters within a camp reflected kinship relationships and ceremonial obligations. The orientation of structures was determined by spiritual considerations, as well as practical factors like wind direction and sun exposure. The materials used in construction were chosen not just for their physical properties, but for their symbolic associations and spiritual significance. The cooking technologies that developed during this period transformed food preparation from simple necessity into sophisticated culinary art. Aboriginal peoples developed techniques for preparing and preserving foods that maximized nutritional value while creating flavors and textures that satisfied aesthetic as well as dietary requirements. Earth ovens that could slow cook large quantities of food for communal feasts, smoking techniques that could preserve meat and fish for months, fermentation processes that enhanced both nutrition and palatability. All of these innovations required detailed understanding of food chemistry and microbiology. The social protocols surrounding food preparation and consumption were equally sophisticated. Different foods were associated with different social categories, with some reserved for initiated adults, others appropriate for children, and still others restricted to particular ceremonial occasions. The sharing of food followed complex rules that reinforced kinship obligations, demonstrated respect for elders, and ensured that everyone in the community received adequate nutrition regardless of their individual hunting or gathering success. These food-sharing systems created powerful social bonds that extended far beyond immediate family relationships. A successful hunter didn't simply keep the results of his efforts, but distributed them according to traditional protocols that might require sharing with dozens of other people. This wasn't charity, but reciprocal obligation, as the hunter could expect similar treatment when others were successful and he was not. These systems created social insurance networks that protected individuals against the inevitable variations in personal fortune while strengthening community cohesion. The technologies for food storage and preservation that developed during this period allowed Aboriginal communities to even out seasonal variations in resource availability without resorting to agriculture or permanent settlements. Techniques for drying, smoking, and caching foods could create reserves that would last through lean periods, while knowledge of which wild resources remained available during different seasons provided backup options when stored foods were exhausted. Water management represented perhaps the most critical technological challenge facing Aboriginal peoples, particularly those living in the arid interior where surface water might be unavailable for months at a time. They developed techniques for locating underground water sources that wouldn't be understood by Western science until the development of modern hydrogeology. They could read subtle changes in vegetation, soil color, and animal behavior that indicated the presence of hidden springs or underground streams. The construction of wells and water storage facilities required sophisticated engineering skills adapted to local geological conditions. In rocky areas, they carved cisterns that could collect and store rainwater during brief wet periods. In sandy regions, they dug wells that could tap into underground water tables while preventing contamination and collapse. These water sources were maintained across generations, with each community taking responsibility for the wells and springs within their territory. The social protocols governing water access were as important as the technologies for finding and storing it. Water sources were often associated with particular ancestral beings and were protected by complex ceremonial obligations that ensured sustainable use. The rights to use particular water sources were inherited through kinship lines and could not be transferred without appropriate ceremonies and community consent. These systems prevented overuse while ensuring that all community members had access to this most vital resource. The medicine and healing practices that developed during this period combined detailed botanical knowledge with sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Aboriginal peoples identified and utilized hundreds of medicinal plants, developing techniques for preparation and administration that maximized therapeutic benefits while minimizing harmful side effects. This knowledge was often closely guarded and transmitted only to individuals who had demonstrated both the intellectual capacity and moral character required to use it responsibly. But Aboriginal healing wasn't limited to herbal remedies. Healers developed techniques for treating psychological and social disorders that were as sophisticated as any modern therapeutic approaches. They understood that individual health was inseparable from community well-being and developed healing practices that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the social and spiritual imbalances that might underlie them. The training required to become a traditional healer was extraordinarily demanding, often requiring decades of apprenticeship and initiation into increasingly specialized knowledge. Healers needed to understand not just the properties of medicinal plants, but the complex relationships between physical, social, and spiritual aspects of health. They served as psychologists, physicians, pharmacists, and spiritual counselors, all rolled into one, requiring a breadth of knowledge and depth of wisdom that few individuals could achieve. The astronomical knowledge that developed during this period allowed Aboriginal peoples to create calendars and navigation systems of remarkable accuracy and sophistication. Different communities developed their own ways of tracking celestial movements, but all shared detailed knowledge of how the positions of stars, planets, and other celestial objects correlated with seasonal changes, weather patterns, and the availability of particular resources. The Southern Cross, visible throughout most of Australia, served as a celestial timepiece that could indicate both the time of night and the time of year. The Coal Sack Nebula, the dark patch near the Southern Cross, was recognized as a marker for seasonal ceremonies and resource availability. The Magellanic Clouds served as guides for long-distance navigation, while the Milky Way was seen as a river of stars with its own seasonal movements and associations. But Aboriginal astronomy wasn't just practical. The movements of celestial objects were integrated into creation stories and ceremonial cycles that gave cosmic significance to human activities. The appearance of particular stars might signal the time for initiation ceremonies, while the positions of planets could influence decisions about when to begin long journeys or conduct important negotiations. This integration of astronomical observation with social and spiritual life created a sophisticated understanding of humanity's place in the cosmic order. The mathematical concepts embedded in Aboriginal culture were equally sophisticated, though expressed in forms that didn't immediately resemble Western mathematical traditions. The kinship systems that governed social relationships required individuals to calculate complex genealogical relationships across multiple generations and collateral lines. The seasonal calendars that guided resource management involved sophisticated calculations about the timing of natural cycles and their interactions with human activities. The geometric patterns found in Aboriginal art weren't just decorative, but encoded mathematical relationships and proportional systems that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of spatial relationships and numerical concepts. The designs painted on bodies during ceremonies, carved into sacred objects, and painted on rock surfaces all followed mathematical principles that created both aesthetic beauty and mnemonic efficiency. Trade and exchange systems that had developed over tens of thousands of years created economic networks of remarkable complexity and extent. Valuable materials might travel across the entire continent through chains of reciprocal exchange that linked communities separated by thousands of kilometers. These weren't simple market relationships, but complex social systems that created lasting obligations and alliances between distant groups. The objects that moved through these trade networks weren't just commodities, but carriers of cultural information and spiritual significance. A piece of ochre from a particular quarry might be valued not just for its color and quality, but for its association with specific creation stories and ceremonial obligations. Pearl shells from northern waters carried the spiritual essence of the sea to inland desert communities, while sacred stones from mountain quarries brought the power of high places to coastal peoples. The protocols governing these exchanges were as important as the objects themselves. Trading relationships were inherited through kinship lines and were maintained through ceremonial obligations that might span generations. The act of exchange wasn't just economic, but deeply social and spiritual, creating bonds between individuals and communities that transcended simple commercial relationships. The languages that developed during this period were among the world's most sophisticated and diverse. Australia was home to over 250 distinct languages at the time of European contact, each adapted to its particular environment and cultural context. These weren't primitive communication systems, but highly developed languages with complex grammatical structures, extensive vocabularies, and sophisticated literary traditions. Many Aboriginal languages contained grammatical features that allowed for extraordinarily precise descriptions of spatial relationships, temporal sequences, and social obligations. Some languages required speakers to indicate their relationship to the person they were addressing, while others demanded constant reference to cardinal directions and geographical landmarks. These linguistic features weren't just grammatical curiosities, but reflected the deep integration of language with landscape, social organization, and spiritual understanding that characterized Aboriginal culture. The oral literature preserved in these languages represented one of humanity's greatest bodies of creative expression. Epic narratives that could take days or weeks to perform in their entirety. Song cycles that traced the journeys of ancestral beings across vast territories. Ceremonial chants that encoded the deepest spiritual knowledge of the community. All of this was maintained through purely oral transmission with remarkable accuracy and consistency. The techniques developed for preserving and transmitting this oral literature were as sophisticated as any writing system. Stories were structured using mnemonic devices that made them virtually impossible to forget, with repetitive patterns, rhythmic elements, and emotional content that embedded information in multiple layers of memory. The training required to become a keeper of oral tradition was rigorous and lengthy, often requiring decades of apprenticeship and practice. But oral tradition wasn't just about preserving ancient knowledge. It was a living system that could incorporate new information and adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential structure and meaning. New stories could be created to explain novel experiences or environmental changes, while traditional narratives could be modified to remain relevant to contemporary conditions. The artistic traditions that flourished during this period weren't separate from these other cultural developments, but were deeply integrated with systems of knowledge transmission, social organization, and spiritual practice. Art wasn't decoration, but communication. Not entertainment, but education. Not individual expression, but community memory made visible. The rock art galleries that were created and maintained over thousands of years served as libraries, schools, and sacred spaces all rolled into one. They preserved information about hunting techniques, seasonal patterns, and ceremonial obligations while serving as focal points for community gatherings and spiritual observances. The creation of new artworks wasn't just artistic activity, but ceremonial practice that reinforced community bonds and spiritual connections. The techniques developed for creating these artworks demonstrated sophisticated understanding of materials science, color theory, and conservation practices. Aboriginal artists developed pigments that could maintain their colors for thousands of years in challenging environmental conditions. They created application techniques that allowed for extraordinary precision and detail while being efficient enough to permit the creation of large-scale works by individual artists or small groups. The symbolic systems embedded in Aboriginal art allowed for the encoding of multiple layers of meaning in single images. A painting might simultaneously tell a creation story, provide a map of local resources, encode kinship relationships, and serve as a mnemonic device for remembering ceremonial obligations. The ability to read these multiple meanings correctly required years of training and cultural knowledge, creating layers of significance that protected sacred information while allowing it to be transmitted to appropriate recipients. The body art traditions that developed during this period were equally sophisticated, transforming the human form into a canvas for expressing identity, status, and spiritual connection. The designs painted on bodies during ceremonies weren't just decoration, but communication systems that conveyed information about the wearer's kinship relationships, ceremonial roles, and spiritual obligations. Different designs were appropriate for different occasions, with some restricted to particular age groups, social categories, or ceremonial contexts. The materials used for body painting were carefully chosen for their symbolic significance, as well as their practical properties. Different colors were associated with different spiritual forces, geographical features, or ancestral beings. The application of these materials wasn't just artistic activity, but ritual practice that transformed the wearer and prepared them for participation in sacred activities. The scarification and other body modification practices that were part of many Aboriginal cultures served similar communicative and spiritual functions. These weren't just marks of identity, but records of achievement, indicators of initiation status, and connections to ancestral power. The creation of these marks was itself a ceremonial activity that transformed both the individual receiving them and the community witnessing the process. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the richness and complexity of the world that Aboriginal peoples had created by this point in their long history. This wasn't a simple or primitive society struggling to survive in a harsh environment, but a sophisticated civilization that had developed sustainable relationships with dozens of different ecosystems, created technologies perfectly adapted to local conditions, established social systems that could maintain stability across vast territories and built spiritual traditions that connected human communities to the deepest patterns of the natural world. The knowledge systems they had developed were as complex as any in human history, encoding information about everything from astronomy and medicine to ecology and psychology in forms that could be preserved and transmitted across hundreds of generations without writing. The social structures they had created were sophisticated enough to coordinate activities across continental distances, while flexible enough to adapt to changing environmental and demographic conditions. The artistic and spiritual traditions they had developed were among humanity's most profound expressions of the relationship between consciousness and cosmos, between individual identity and universal patterns, between human creativity and natural process. These weren't just cultural achievements, but fundamental insights into the nature of existence itself. Insights that would continue to guide Aboriginal communities through whatever challenges lay ahead. The Australia that existed at this point in Aboriginal history was not an empty continent waiting for civilization to arrive, but a carefully managed landscape shaped by tens of thousands of years of human presence and wisdom. Every waterhole, every mountain, every stretch of coastline had its human story, its place in the complex web of relationships that connected people to country and to each other. The continent itself had become a vast library of human knowledge, a sacred text written in stone and soil, in the movements of animals and the patterns of plant growth, in the flow of rivers and the rhythm of seasons. This was the foundation upon which Aboriginal civilization would continue to build and flourish, adapting to new challenges while maintaining its essential character, evolving new solutions while preserving ancient wisdom, creating new stories while honoring the eternal truths embedded in the Dreamtime narratives that had guided their ancestors since the beginning of human time in Australia. The dance between human consciousness and the living landscape grew ever more intricate as the millennia unfolded. Aboriginal peoples had not merely adapted to their environments, they had entered into conversations with them, learning to read the subtle languages of stone and stream, wind and weather, in ways that transformed both the land and its human inhabitants. This was not domination of nature, but partnership with it, a relationship so profound that the boundary between the human and natural worlds became beautifully blurred. In the vast interior of the continent, where the red earth stretches toward horizons that shimmer in the heat, Aboriginal communities developed what may have been humanity's most sophisticated understanding of arid land management. They learned to see water where others saw only emptiness, to find abundance where others perceived scarcity. The desert, to uninformed eyes, might appear lifeless and uniform, but to Aboriginal peoples, it was a complex tapestry of micro-environments, each with its own seasonal rhythms, its own hidden resources, its own place in the larger patterns of survival and ceremony. The techniques they developed for reading this landscape were extraordinary in their subtlety and precision. They could determine the presence of underground water by observing the flight patterns of birds, the growth habits of particular plants, even the behavior of insects. They learned that certain trees, their roots extending deep into hidden aquifers, would remain green during droughts that withered the surrounding vegetation. They discovered that the morning songs of specific bird species could indicate not just the presence of water, but its depth, quality, and seasonal reliability. This knowledge wasn't simply practical information to be memorized and applied. It was woven into the very fabric of spiritual understanding, embedded in creation stories that explained why particular landscape features held water, which ancestral beings had traveled through specific areas during the Dreamtime, and what ceremonies were necessary to maintain the spiritual relationships that kept the water flowing. A waterhole wasn't just a resource to be exploited, but a sacred site with its own personality, its own history, its own requirements for proper respect and care. The social structures that evolved to manage these precious water resources were equally sophisticated. Rights to particular water sources were inherited through complex kinship systems that ensured sustainable use, while preventing conflicts that could destroy communities. Elders who held the knowledge of water locations and the ceremonies associated with them occupied positions of enormous responsibility, as their decisions could mean the difference between survival and death during drought years. The seasonal movements of desert peoples were choreographed with precision that would impress modern logisticians. Communities would time their travels to arrive at different water sources just as seasonal rains were filling them, or just before the peak availability of particular food resources. These journeys weren't random wandering, but carefully planned expeditions that required intimate knowledge of weather patterns, plant phenology, and animal behavior across vast territories. Along the continent's extensive coastline, Aboriginal peoples developed equally sophisticated relationships with marine environments. They became master readers of tides and currents, weather patterns, and seasonal changes that affected the availability of different sea creatures. They learned to predict when particular fish would be running, when shellfish would be at their peak condition, when sea mammals would be passing through their territories during migration. The fishing technologies they developed were marvels of engineering adapted to local conditions. In the tropical north, they created elaborate fish traps from stone and brush that could channel entire schools of fish into holding areas where they could be easily harvested. These structures, some of which still function today, required sophisticated understanding of fish behavior, water flow, and construction techniques that could withstand the destructive forces of tropical storms and seasonal flooding. The nets they wove from plant fibers were equally impressive, with different designs for different types of fishing and different environmental conditions. Some were designed to be worked by individuals in shallow water. Others required coordinated efforts by entire communities to operate in deeper waters or stronger currents. The fibers used in their construction were carefully selected and processed to achieve the right combination of strength, flexibility, and durability for their intended use. Coastal communities also developed sophisticated techniques for harvesting shellfish and other marine resources in ways that ensured their continued abundance. They learned which areas could be harvested intensively and which needed to be rested to allow populations to recover. They developed rotation systems that moved harvesting pressure around different parts of their territories, preventing overexploitation while maintaining steady food supplies. The boats they built for marine hunting and transportation demonstrated remarkable innovation and adaptation to local conditions. In the tropical north, they created bark canoes that were lightweight enough to be carried over land between waterways, but sturdy enough to handle rough seas and river rapids. The techniques for selecting, harvesting, and shaping the bark required specialized knowledge that was passed down through generations of master boat builders. In other regions, they developed reed boats, log rafts, and other watercraft perfectly suited to their local environments and intended uses. Some were designed for river travel, others for coastal fishing, still others for crossing large bodies of water. Each design represented centuries of experimentation and refinement, with every detail optimized for its specific purpose. The navigation techniques used by coastal peoples were equally sophisticated. They learned to read wave patterns, cloud formations, and bird behavior to navigate safely in conditions that would challenge modern sailors with electronic instruments. They could determine their position and direction by observing subtle changes in watercolor, the types of floating debris, and the species of seabirds they encountered. These navigation skills weren't just technical knowledge, but were embedded in spiritual traditions that connected human travelers to the cosmic forces that governed wind and wave. Creation stories explained the formation of islands, reefs, and currents in terms that encoded practical navigation information while providing spiritual guidance for safe travel. The act of navigation itself became a form of prayer, a way of maintaining proper relationships with the spiritual forces that controlled the marine environment. In the mountainous regions of southeastern Australia, Aboriginal peoples adapted to yet another set of environmental challenges and opportunities. The high country presented unique seasonal patterns, with resources that were abundant during the brief summer months, but largely inaccessible during winter when snow covered the peaks and valleys. This created different patterns of movement and resource use than those found in other parts of the continent. The summer gatherings that took place in the high country were among the largest and most elaborate social events in Aboriginal Australia. Communities that spent most of the year in smaller groups scattered across the lower elevations would come together during the brief mountain summer to harvest the abundant resources that were available only at high altitudes. The bogong moths that migrated to the mountains in enormous numbers provided a concentrated protein source that could support large gatherings for extended periods. These gatherings weren't just opportunities for resource harvesting, but were crucial social and ceremonial events that maintained connections between communities across vast territories. Young people would be initiated into adult responsibilities. Marriages would be arranged between distant groups. Trade goods would be exchanged, and the complex body of traditional knowledge would be passed from elders to the next generation. The technologies developed for high-altitude living demonstrated remarkable innovation and adaptation. The shelters built for mountain camps had to withstand sudden weather changes, including snow and freezing temperatures even during summer months. The clothing and equipment used in the high country had to be lightweight enough for the long journey from lower elevations, but warm and durable enough for mountain conditions. The food processing techniques developed for mountain resources were equally specialized. The bogong moths that were such an important resource had to be carefully processed to remove their wings and legs before being cooked and preserved. The techniques for smoking and drying these insects created concentrated food sources that could be stored for months and transported back to lower elevations when the gatherings ended. The spiritual significance of the mountain gatherings was as important as their practical functions. The high peaks were seen as places where the earth reached closest to the sky, where human activities could connect most directly with cosmic forces. The ceremonies performed in these elevated locations had special power and significance, creating spiritual connections that linked communities across the lowland territories where they spent most of their lives. Throughout all these different environments, Aboriginal peoples continued to refine and develop their understanding of ecological relationships and environmental management. They learned to see landscapes not as collections of separate resources, but as integrated systems, where changes in one area could affect conditions hundreds of kilometers away. Their burning practices, for example, weren't just local land management, but part of continental-scale systems that influenced weather patterns, animal migrations, and plant distributions across vast regions. The complexity of these ecological relationships was encoded in Dreamtime stories that tracked the journeys of ancestral beings across multiple environments and through different seasonal cycles. A single creation narrative might begin in the high mountains, follow river systems through inland plains, cross desert regions, and end at coastal locations, encoding information about ecological connections that spanned the entire continent. These stories served as sophisticated ecological models that helped communities understand how their local activities fit into larger environmental patterns. They provided guidance for managing resources in ways that considered not just immediate local effects, but long-term consequences that might manifest in distant locations or future generations. The social mechanisms for coordinating these large-scale environmental management activities were equally sophisticated. Information about environmental conditions, resource availability, and management needs was shared through the trade networks and ceremonial gatherings that connected communities across vast distances. Decisions about when and where to burn, which areas to harvest intensively, and which to protect, were made through consultation processes that could involve communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. The artistic traditions that flourished during this period continued to evolve in sophistication and complexity. Rock art sites became increasingly elaborate, with some galleries containing thousands of individual images created over many centuries. These weren't just artistic displays, but were living documents that recorded environmental changes, cultural innovations, and spiritual insights across countless generations. The techniques used to create these artworks became increasingly sophisticated, with artists developing methods for creating images that would remain visible and meaningful for thousands of years. They learned to prepare rock surfaces that would accept paint reliably, to create pigments that would maintain their colors in challenging environmental conditions, and to develop artistic conventions that could encode multiple layers of meaning in single images. The training required to become a master artist was extraordinarily demanding, requiring not just technical skill, but deep knowledge of traditional symbols, creation stories, and ceremonial protocols. Artists needed to understand which images were appropriate for different locations, which symbols could be viewed by which categories of people, and how to create works that would serve both artistic and educational functions. The body painting traditions that accompanied major ceremonies became increasingly elaborate during this period. The designs painted on participants' bodies weren't just decoration, but were complex communication systems that conveyed information about kinship relationships, ceremonial roles, and spiritual connections. Different ceremonies required different design systems, with some restricted to particular age groups, social categories, or ceremonial contexts. The materials used for body painting were carefully chosen for their symbolic significance as well as their practical properties. Different colors were associated with different spiritual forces, geographical features, or ancestral beings. The application of these materials wasn't just artistic activity, but ritual practice that transformed the wearer and prepared them for participation in sacred activities. The musical traditions that developed during this period were equally sophisticated, with different instruments and song styles adapted to different ceremonial contexts and regional preferences. The didgeridoo, perhaps the most famous Aboriginal musical instrument, required years of training to master and was associated with complex ceremonial and spiritual obligations in the regions where it was used. The songs that accompanied ceremonies weren't just entertainment, but were sophisticated mnemonic devices that preserved important cultural information. Song cycles could take days or weeks to perform in their entirety and contain detailed information about geography, genealogy, law, and spiritual obligations. The melodies, rhythms, and vocal techniques used in these songs were designed to make them memorable and to create emotional states appropriate for different ceremonial purposes. The dance traditions that accompanied these musical performances were equally complex, with different movements associated with different animals, ancestral beings, or natural phenomena. Dancers needed to understand not just the physical movements, but their symbolic meanings and the proper contexts in which they could be performed. Some dances were restricted to particular categories of people, while others required coordinated performances by large groups of participants. The crafts and technologies that supported these artistic and ceremonial traditions continued to evolve in sophistication and beauty. The production of ceremonial objects required specialized knowledge and skills that were often closely guarded and transmitted only to appropriate recipients. Sacred boards, carved stones, woven items, and other ritual objects were created according to precise specifications that encoded spiritual and cultural meanings. The tools used in everyday life also reflected aesthetic considerations, as well as practical functions. Spear throwers, digging sticks, carrying vessels, and other utilitarian objects were often decorated with carved or painted designs that indicated their owners' identities, spiritual affiliations, or ceremonial status. The creation of these objects wasn't just craft production, but was embedded in spiritual practices that connected makers to their ancestral traditions. The trade networks that connected communities across the continent continued to expand and become more sophisticated during this period. Valuable materials could travel thousands of kilometers through chains of reciprocal exchange that created lasting relationships between distant communities. These networks weren't just economic systems, but were social and spiritual connections that maintained continental-scale cultural unity despite the diversity of local traditions. The objects that moved through these trade networks carried not just material value but cultural and spiritual significance that connected distant communities to shared traditions and beliefs. A piece of ochre from a particular quarry might be valued not just for its color and quality, but for its association with specific creation stories and ceremonial obligations. Pearl shells from northern waters carried the spiritual essence of the sea to inland desert communities, while sacred stones from mountain quarries brought the power of high places to coastal peoples. The protocols governing these exchanges were as important as the objects themselves. Trading relationships were inherited through kinship lines and were maintained through ceremonial obligations that might span generations. The act of exchange wasn't just economic, but deeply social and spiritual, creating bonds between individuals and communities that transcended simple commercial relationships. The languages that had developed across the continent continued to evolve and diversify, with each community adapting their speech to reflect their particular environment and cultural focus. The vocabularies developed by different groups reflected their specialized knowledge and activities, with some languages containing hundreds of terms for different types of plants, others having elaborate systems for describing kinship relationships, and still others developing precise terminology for astronomical observations or ceremonial protocols. The poetic and narrative traditions preserved in these languages represented some of humanity's greatest achievements in oral literature, epic stories that could take weeks to tell in their entirety, song cycles that traced the journeys of creation beings across vast territories, ceremonial chants that encoded the deepest spiritual knowledge of the community. All of this was maintained through purely oral transmission with remarkable accuracy and consistency. The techniques developed for preserving and transmitting this oral literature were as sophisticated as any writing system. Stories were structured using mnemonic devices that made them virtually impossible to forget, with repetitive patterns, rhythmic elements, and emotional content that embedded information in multiple layers of memory. The training required to become a keeper of oral tradition was rigorous and lengthy, often requiring decades of apprenticeship and practice. The spiritual and philosophical traditions that had developed over tens of thousands of years continued to evolve in depth and sophistication. The Dreamtime understanding of reality provided frameworks for understanding everything from the formation of landscape features to the proper conduct of social relationships. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated philosophical systems that integrated practical knowledge with spiritual insight in ways that provided guidance for every aspect of life. The creation stories that explained the formation of the world weren't just mythological narratives, but were complex teachings that encoded information about geology, ecology, astronomy, and human psychology. The ancestral beings whose journeys were described in these stories weren't just supernatural characters, but were representations of natural forces, social principles, and spiritual truths that continued to influence the world. The ceremonial practices that maintained connections to these spiritual realities were among the most sophisticated ritual systems ever developed by human societies. Major ceremonies could involve hundreds of participants and require months of preparation, with every detail carefully planned and executed according to traditional protocols. These weren't just religious observances, but were complex educational experiences that transmitted cultural knowledge while reinforcing social bonds and spiritual connections. The initiation ceremonies that marked transitions from one life stage to another were particularly elaborate and meaningful. These weren't just coming-of-age rituals, but were comprehensive educational programs that prepared individuals for their adult responsibilities while connecting them to the spiritual traditions of their ancestors. The knowledge transmitted during these ceremonies wasn't just practical information, but included the deepest spiritual and cultural insights of the community. The healing traditions that had developed over thousands of years combined detailed botanical knowledge with sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Traditional healers were trained not just in the use of medicinal plants, but in the complex relationships between physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of health. They understood that individual well-being was inseparable from community harmony and developed healing practices that addressed both personal symptoms and social imbalances. The training required to become a traditional healer was extraordinarily demanding, often requiring decades of apprenticeship under experienced practitioners. Healers needed to understand not just the properties of medicinal plants, but the proper ceremonies for gathering them, the appropriate times for different treatments, and the social protocols that governed their practice. They served as physicians, psychologists, spiritual counselors, and community mediators all rolled into one. The astronomical knowledge that had developed over thousands of years of careful observation allowed Aboriginal peoples to create calendars and navigation systems of remarkable accuracy and sophistication. Different communities developed their own ways of tracking celestial movements, but all shared detailed knowledge of how the positions of stars, planets, and other celestial objects correlated with seasonal changes, weather patterns, and the availability of particular resources. The Southern Cross served as a celestial timepiece that could indicate both the time of night and the time of year with remarkable precision. The Coal Sack Nebula, the dark patch near the Southern Cross, was recognized as a marker for seasonal ceremonies and resource availability. The Magellanic Clouds served as guides for long-distance navigation, while the Milky Way was seen as a river of stars with its own seasonal movements and associations. But Aboriginal astronomy wasn't just practical navigation and timekeeping. The movements of celestial objects were integrated into creation stories and ceremonial cycles that gave cosmic significance to human activities. The appearance of particular stars might signal the time for initiation ceremonies, while the positions of planets could influence decisions about when to begin long journeys or conduct important negotiations. As you continue drifting toward deeper sleep, envision the extraordinary world that Aboriginal peoples had created through their tens of thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and spiritual development. This was a civilization that had achieved something perhaps unique in human history. A way of life that was simultaneously highly sophisticated and completely sustainable, technologically advanced and spiritually profound, socially complex and environmentally harmonious. The knowledge systems they had developed encoded more information about the natural world than most modern libraries contain, yet it was all preserved in human memory and transmitted through story, song, and ceremony. The technologies they had created were perfectly adapted to their environments and purposes, requiring no external energy sources and producing no waste that couldn't be recycled by natural processes. The social systems they had established could coordinate activities across continental distances while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. The spiritual traditions they had developed provided frameworks for understanding existence that integrated scientific observation with aesthetic appreciation and ethical guidance. This was not a primitive society struggling to survive in a harsh environment, but a mature civilization that had solved fundamental problems of human existence in ways that allowed for both individual fulfillment and collective prosperity. They had created sustainable abundance through careful management rather than intensive exploitation, achieved social harmony through inclusive participation rather than hierarchical control, and maintained spiritual connection through direct experience rather than abstract doctrine. The Australia they inhabited was not an empty wilderness, but a carefully tended landscape shaped by thousands of generations of human wisdom and care. Every feature of the environment bore the subtle influence of Aboriginal management, from the species composition of forests, shaped by strategic burning, to the behavior patterns of animals influenced by hunting protocols that ensured sustainable populations. The Dreamtime stories that explained the creation of this landscape weren't just ancient myths, but were living teachings that continued to guide environmental management and spiritual practice. The ancestral beings whose journeys were described in these stories weren't just supernatural characters, but were representations of ecological processes, social principles, and spiritual truths that remained relevant to contemporary life. This was the foundation upon which Aboriginal civilization continued to build and flourish, adapting to new challenges while maintaining its essential character, evolving new solutions while preserving ancient wisdom, creating new stories while honoring the eternal truths embedded in the Dreamtime narratives that had guided their ancestors since the beginning of human time in Australia. The songs that preserved this knowledge continued to be sung around campfires under the Southern Cross, their melodies carrying the wisdom of countless generations into the present moment. The dances that celebrated these traditions continued to be performed at sacred sites across the continent, their movements connecting contemporary dancers to the eternal rhythms of the Dreamtime. The stories that explained the meaning of existence continued to be shared between elders and young people, their teachings as relevant to human life as they had been when first spoken tens of thousands of years before. This extraordinary web of knowledge, ceremony, and connection to country would face its greatest test as new voices began to echo across the vast waters that had protected Australia for so long. The isolation that had allowed Aboriginal civilization to develop its unique characteristics was about to end, but the wisdom accumulated over 65,000 years would prove more resilient than anyone could imagine. By the time strange sails appeared on distant horizons, Aboriginal Australia had reached a level of cultural sophistication that represented the culmination of humanity's longest continuous experiment in sustainable living. The communities scattered across the continent weren't isolated fragments, but were connected through invisible threads of kinship, ceremony, and shared understanding that created a civilization unlike any other on Earth. The trade routes that carried precious ochre from the heart of the continent to coastal communities weren't just economic networks, but were pathways of cultural exchange that kept distant communities connected to shared traditions and innovations. When a new ceremony was developed in one region, knowledge of it could spread across thousands of kilometers through these established networks, creating continental-scale cultural unity despite the incredible diversity of local adaptations. The seasonal gatherings that brought together communities from vast territories weren't just social events, but were sophisticated conferences where knowledge was shared, Innovations were discussed, and collective decisions were made about resource management across entire bioregions. Elders who held specialized knowledge about astronomy, medicine, or environmental management would travel enormous distances to participate in these gatherings, ensuring that crucial information was preserved and transmitted to the next generation. The young people who attended these gatherings weren't passive recipients of ancient wisdom, but were active participants in an ongoing process of cultural development and adaptation. They learned not just what their ancestors had discovered, but how to continue the process of observation, experimentation, and innovation that had allowed Aboriginal culture to thrive for so many millennia. The initiation ceremonies that marked their transition to adult status weren't just ritual observances, but were comprehensive educational programs that prepared them to take their place as responsible members of communities that had maintained their essential character across more generations than any other human society had ever achieved. They learned not just practical skills, but the philosophical frameworks that would guide their decision-making throughout their lives. The sacred sites that dotted the landscape weren't just places of worship, but were libraries of knowledge where information about everything from geology and hydrology to astronomy and psychology was encoded in stone, preserved in story, and transmitted through ceremony. These sites served as focal points for communities that might be scattered across vast territories for most of the year, but came together at crucial times to maintain their connections to country and to each other. The Dreamtime stories associated with these sites weren't just ancient myths, but were living teachings that continued to provide guidance for contemporary challenges. When environmental conditions changed, when new situations arose, when conflicts needed resolution, the wisdom embedded in these stories provided frameworks for understanding and response that had been tested and refined over thousands of generations. The artistic traditions that flourished around these sacred sites continued to evolve and develop, with each generation of artists adding their own insights and innovations while maintaining connection to ancestral traditions. The rock art galleries that served as outdoor museums and schools contained works spanning tens of thousands of years, creating visual records of cultural development that were unmatched anywhere else in the world. The techniques used to create these artworks had reached levels of sophistication that combined aesthetic beauty with practical function in ways that modern artists still struggle to understand. The pigments used could maintain their colors for millennia. The application methods created images that remained visible and meaningful across countless generations, and the symbolic systems encoded multiple layers of information in forms that were both artistically satisfying and educationally effective. The musical traditions that accompanied these artistic expressions had evolved into complex systems that could preserve and transmit vast amounts of cultural information through purely oral means. Song cycles that took weeks to perform in their entirety contained detailed information about geography, genealogy, law, ecology, and spiritual obligations, all woven together in melodic forms that made them virtually impossible to forget. The instruments used in these performances weren't just musical tools, but were sacred objects that connected performers to ancestral traditions and spiritual forces. The didgeridoo, with its deep, resonant tones, wasn't just an instrument, but was a technology for altering consciousness, creating meditative states that facilitated spiritual communication and ceremonial transformation. The dances that accompanied these musical performances were equally sophisticated, with different movements associated with different animals, ancestral beings, or natural phenomena. Dancers needed to understand not just the physical movements, but their symbolic meanings, the stories they told, and the spiritual connections they created between performers and the forces they represented. The costumes and body decorations used in these performances were themselves works of art that required specialized knowledge and skills to create. The designs painted on dancers' bodies weren't just decoration, but were complex communication systems that conveyed information about kinship relationships, ceremonial roles, and spiritual connections. Different ceremonies required different design systems, with some restricted to particular categories of people, and others requiring coordinated performances by large groups of participants. The feathers, shells, ochres, and other materials used in these decorations weren't chosen randomly, but were selected for their symbolic significance and spiritual associations. Each material carried its own meanings and powers, and the combination of different elements created messages and connections that were understood by initiated members of the community. The social protocols that governed these ceremonial activities were as complex as the artistic expressions themselves. Who could participate in which ceremonies? What roles different people could play? How conflicts were resolved? How decisions were made? All of these aspects of ceremonial life were governed by intricate rules that had evolved over thousands of years to ensure both individual fulfillment and collective harmony. The leadership structures that guided these activities weren't based on authoritarian control, but on earned respect and demonstrated wisdom. Elders who had shown their knowledge, judgment, and commitment to community welfare over many years provided guidance and direction. But important decisions were made through extended consultation processes that included all adult members of the community. These decision-making processes could take days or weeks to complete, but they ensured that major changes had broad support and wouldn't create lasting divisions within the group. The patience and wisdom required for this kind of consensus building reflected the deep understanding that individual actions affected the entire community and that lasting solutions required collective commitment. The conflict resolution mechanisms that had developed over thousands of years were equally sophisticated, providing ways to address disputes and grievances that restored harmony without destroying relationships. These weren't just legal procedures, but were therapeutic processes that addressed the underlying causes of conflict while healing the social wounds that disputes could create. The ceremonies associated with conflict resolution often involved ritual combat, formal exchanges of grievances, and symbolic acts of reconciliation that allowed all parties to maintain their dignity while restoring community peace. These processes recognized that conflict was a natural part of human social life, but that it needed to be managed in ways that strengthened rather than weakened community bonds. The marriage customs that governed relationship formation weren't just personal arrangements, but were complex social contracts that created connections between families and communities across vast territories. The kinship systems that determined appropriate marriage partners weren't arbitrary rules, but were sophisticated mechanisms for preventing inbreeding while creating networks of mutual obligation and support. The courtship practices that preceded marriage weren't just romantic activities, but were extended processes of negotiation and evaluation that ensured compatibility not just between individuals, but between the families and communities they represented. These processes could take months or years to complete and involved exchanges of gifts, demonstrations of skills and knowledge, and participation in ceremonies that tested the commitment and suitability of potential partners. The wedding ceremonies themselves weren't just celebrations, but were complex rituals that transformed individual relationships into social institutions with obligations and privileges that extended far beyond the married couple. The exchanges of gifts, the performances of specific dances and songs, the painting of particular designs on the participants' bodies, all of these elements created spiritual and social bonds that connected the new marriage to the broader patterns of community life. The child-rearing practices that shaped the next generation weren't just parental responsibilities, but were community-wide commitments that ensured every child received the knowledge, skills, and values they needed to become contributing members of society. Children weren't raised just by their biological parents, but by extended networks of relatives and community members who took responsibility for different aspects of their development. The educational systems that transmitted cultural knowledge weren't formal schools, but were integrated into every aspect of daily life. Children learned by observing and participating in adult activities, by listening to stories and songs, by practicing skills under the guidance of experienced teachers, and by gradually taking on increasing responsibilities as they demonstrated their readiness. The games and play activities that occupied children's time weren't just entertainment, but were carefully designed learning experiences that taught important skills and values. Traditional games taught coordination, strategy, cooperation, and competition in balanced ways that prepared children for their adult roles while allowing them to develop their individual talents and interests. The coming-of-age ceremonies that marked the transition to adult status weren't just ritual observances, but were comprehensive educational programs that prepared young people for the full responsibilities of community membership. These ceremonies could last for months and involved intensive instruction in traditional knowledge, practical skills, social obligations, and spiritual understanding. The ordeals and challenges that were part of many initiation ceremonies weren't just tests of courage, but were transformative experiences that created psychological and spiritual changes necessary for adult responsibility. The physical challenges, the periods of isolation, the instruction in sacred knowledge, all of these elements worked together to create mature individuals who were ready to take their place as full members of their communities. The gender roles that structured adult life weren't rigid hierarchies, but were complementary systems that recognized the different but equally important contributions that men and women made to community survival and prosperity. While men and women often had different primary responsibilities, there was considerable flexibility and overlap in their roles, and both were recognized as essential for the proper functioning of society. The women's knowledge systems that governed plant resources, food processing, childcare, and many ceremonial activities were considered just as sacred and important as the men's knowledge of hunting, tool-making, and other ceremonial responsibilities. Both were protected and transmitted through equally complex systems of initiation and instruction, and both were recognized as essential components of the cultural wisdom that had sustained Aboriginal communities for thousands of generations. The seasonal cycles that structured community life weren't just practical schedules, but were spiritual rhythms that connected human activities to the larger patterns of the natural world. The timing of ceremonies, the movements between different camps, the harvesting of particular resources. All of these activities were coordinated with natural cycles in ways that created harmony between human needs and environmental processes. The weather patterns that influenced these seasonal movements weren't just practical considerations, but were understood as the activities of ancestral beings whose moods and movements continued to shape the world. The ceremonies performed to ensure favorable weather weren't just superstitious rituals, but were sophisticated attempts to maintain proper relationships with the spiritual forces that governed natural processes. The environmental management practices that had developed over thousands of years weren't just conservation measures, but were expressions of spiritual relationships between human communities and the landscape. The careful burning that maintained habitat diversity, the harvesting protocols that ensured sustainable populations, the protection of sacred sites that served as refuges for wildlife. All of these practices reflected deep understanding of ecological relationships, combined with spiritual obligations to care for country. The mapping systems that encoded knowledge of vast territories weren't just practical navigation tools, but were spiritual documents that recorded the journeys of ancestral beings and the sacred obligations associated with different locations. These maps existed not as physical documents, but as songs, stories, and ceremonies that could guide travelers across thousands of kilometers of challenging terrain while maintaining their spiritual connections to the landscape. The trade networks that connected communities across the continent weren't just economic systems, but were cultural highways that maintained continental-scale connections between diverse local traditions. The objects that moved along these networks carried not just material value, but spiritual significance that linked distant communities to shared beliefs and practices. The diplomatic protocols that governed relationships between different communities weren't just practical arrangements, but were complex systems of reciprocal obligation that created lasting bonds between groups that might otherwise have been competitors for resources. These relationships were maintained through ceremonial exchanges, intermarriage, and shared participation in religious activities that created ties stronger than simple economic or political alliances. The languages that had developed across the continent represented one of humanity's greatest achievements in cultural diversity and sophistication. With over 250 distinct languages at the time of European contact, Australia had more linguistic diversity than any other continent, with each language perfectly adapted to its particular environment and cultural context. The grammatical structures of these languages often required speakers to indicate their relationship to the landscape, with some languages demanding constant reference to cardinal directions and others requiring specification of the speaker's relationship to the person being addressed. These linguistic features weren't just grammatical curiosities, but reflected the deep integration of language with landscape, social organization, and spiritual understanding that characterized Aboriginal culture. The storytelling traditions preserved in these languages represented some of humanity's greatest achievements in oral literature. Epic narratives that could take days or weeks to perform contained not just entertainment, but encoded practical knowledge, spiritual wisdom, and cultural values in forms that were both memorable and meaningful. These stories weren't just ancient myths, but were living teachings that continued to provide guidance for contemporary challenges. The poetic traditions that flourished in these languages created some of the world's most sophisticated verse forms, with complex rhythmic patterns, intricate rhyme schemes, and symbolic imagery that could convey multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. The training required to become a master storyteller or poet was extraordinarily demanding, requiring not just artistic skill, but deep knowledge of traditional culture and spiritual understanding. As the tens of thousands of years of Aboriginal cultural development reached their culmination, the continent supported perhaps 300,000 people living in hundreds of distinct communities, each adapted to their particular environment while maintaining connections to the broader patterns of Aboriginal civilization. This population level represented a careful balance between human needs and environmental capacity that had been maintained for millennia through sophisticated cultural mechanisms. The density of population in different regions reflected not just environmental carrying capacity, but cultural choices about how to live in harmony with particular landscapes. Coastal areas with abundant marine resources supported larger communities, while arid interior regions were home to smaller groups with more mobile lifestyles. But all were connected through the invisible networks of kinship, ceremony, and shared understanding that created unity within diversity. The artistic achievements of this period represented the culmination of thousands of years of creative development. Rock art galleries contained works spanning tens of thousands of years, creating visual records of cultural evolution that were unmatched anywhere else in the world. The techniques and styles had reached levels of sophistication that combined aesthetic beauty with spiritual meaning and practical function in ways that continue to inspire contemporary artists. The technological achievements were equally impressive, with tools and techniques perfectly adapted to every conceivable purpose and environmental condition. The boomerangs that could return to their throwers with uncanny accuracy, the spear throwers that could double the range and force of hunting weapons, the fire-making techniques that could create flame from the most unlikely materials. All of these innovations represented the culmination of thousands of years of experimentation and refinement. The social achievements were perhaps most remarkable of all. Aboriginal communities had created ways of organizing human relationships that could maintain harmony and cooperation across vast territories and long periods of time, without the coercive hierarchies that characterized most other human societies. The kinship systems, conflict resolution mechanisms, and decision-making processes they had developed represented sophisticated solutions to fundamental problems of human social organization. The spiritual achievements that integrated all these other accomplishments into coherent worldviews provided frameworks for understanding existence that combined scientific observation with aesthetic appreciation and ethical guidance. The Dreamtime understanding of reality offered explanations for everything from geological processes to social relationships, all woven together in narrative forms that were both intellectually satisfying and emotionally meaningful. This was the magnificent civilization that had flowered in isolation for 65,000 years, creating perhaps the most sustainable and sophisticated adaptation to the natural world that humanity had ever achieved. The knowledge systems they had developed contained more information about their environments than most modern libraries, yet it was all preserved in human memory and transmitted through story, song, and ceremony. The technologies they had created were perfectly adapted to their purposes and environments, requiring no external energy sources and producing no waste that couldn't be recycled by natural processes. The social systems they had established could coordinate activities across continental distances while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. The spiritual traditions they had developed provided frameworks for understanding existence that integrated scientific observation with aesthetic appreciation and ethical guidance. As you sink deeper into the peaceful rhythm of sleep, let your mind rest in the profound wisdom of this ancient civilization. Feel the connection to the eternal dreamtime that flows through every story, every ceremony, every sacred site across the vast Australian continent. In the gentle darkness behind your closed eyes, the ancestral beings continue their eternal journeys, creating and recreating the world through their dreams, their songs, their endless dance across the landscape of human consciousness and natural wonder. The whispered stories carried on the night wind speak of changes approaching from beyond the curved edge of the world. For countless generations, the great waters had served as both protection and boundary, their endless expanse ensuring that the ancient ways could flourish undisturbed. But the same currents that brought seasonal fish runs and monsoon rains would soon carry vessels unlike any the coastal watchers had ever seen. In the final centuries before these changes, Aboriginal communities reached what might be considered the golden age of their remarkable civilization. The balance between human needs and environmental capacity had been perfected through millennia of careful observation and adjustment. Population levels across the continent had stabilized at sustainable numbers that allowed for both individual fulfillment and collective prosperity without straining the natural systems that supported all life. The seasonal rhythms that governed daily existence had become as reliable and predictable as the movements of the stars themselves. Communities knew precisely when to expect the first flowering of particular plants, when specific animals would begin their breeding cycles, when the rains would arrive to fill the waterholes, and when the dry season would demand movement to more sheltered locations. This knowledge wasn't simply accumulated information, but had become embedded in the very DNA of cultural practice. The young people born into this mature civilization inherited not just practical skills, but sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding their place in the cosmic order. They learned to see themselves not as separate beings struggling against a hostile environment, but as integral components of living systems that included everything from the smallest insects to the most distant stars. Their education prepared them not just to survive, but to contribute to the ongoing creative process that kept the world in harmony. The ceremonies that marked the passage of seasons had evolved into spectacular multimedia experiences that combined music, dance, visual art, storytelling, and dramatic performance in ways that engaged every sense and emotion. These weren't simply religious observances, but were comprehensive educational programs that transmitted the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, while celebrating the beauty and mystery of existence itself. The sacred sites that dotted the landscape had become increasingly elaborate and meaningful over the millennia. What might have begun as simple camping places associated with particular resources had evolved into complex ceremonial centers that served as focal points for communities scattered across vast territories. These sites contained not just physical structures, but layers of meaning that connected local activities to continental patterns and cosmic rhythms. The rock art galleries that adorned these sacred places had grown into vast libraries of visual information that recorded everything from practical hunting techniques to astronomical observations to spiritual insights. The images painted and carved on these stone surfaces weren't just artistic expressions, but were sophisticated communication systems that could convey complex information across generations and between different communities. The techniques used to create these artworks had reached extraordinary levels of refinement. Artists had learned to prepare rock surfaces that would accept pigments reliably, to create colors that would maintain their intensity for thousands of years, and to develop symbolic systems that could encode multiple layers of meaning in single images. The training required to become a master artist involved not just technical skill, but deep knowledge of traditional symbols, creation stories, and ceremonial protocols. The musical traditions that accompanied these visual arts had similarly evolved into complex systems that could preserve and transmit vast amounts of cultural information through purely oral means. Song cycles that took weeks to perform in their entirety contained detailed geographical information, genealogical records, legal precedents, ecological knowledge, and spiritual teachings all woven together in melodic forms that made them virtually impossible to forget. The instruments used in these performances had been refined through countless generations of experimentation and innovation. The didgeridoo, with its deep, resonant tones, had become not just a musical instrument, but a technology for altering consciousness and facilitating spiritual communication. Different regions had developed their own distinctive instruments and playing techniques, creating a rich diversity of musical expression within the broader patterns of Aboriginal culture. The dances that accompanied these musical performances were equally sophisticated, with different movements associated with different animals, ancestral beings, or natural phenomena. Dancers needed to understand not just the physical choreography, but the stories being told, the spiritual connections being created, and the proper contexts in which different dances could be performed. Some dances were restricted to particular categories of people, while others required coordinated performances by large groups of participants. The costumes and body decorations used in these performances represented artistic achievements in their own right. The designs painted on dancers' bodies weren't random decoration, but were complex communication systems that conveyed information about kinship relationships, ceremonial roles, and spiritual connections. Different ceremonies required different design systems, with some restricted to initiated adults and others appropriate for broader community participation. The materials used in these decorations were selected not just for their practical properties, but for their symbolic significance and spiritual associations. Ochres from particular quarries carried the spiritual essence of those places. Feathers from specific birds connected dancers to the powers associated with different species. Shells from distant waters brought the energy of the sea to inland ceremonies. The combination of these materials created messages and connections that were understood by initiated members of the community. The trade networks that supplied these ceremonial materials had evolved into sophisticated systems that connected communities across the entire continent. Valuable substances could travel thousands of kilometers through chains of reciprocal exchange that created lasting relationships between distant groups. These networks weren't just economic arrangements, but were social and spiritual connections that maintained continental-scale cultural unity despite the incredible diversity of local adaptations. The protocols governing these exchanges were as important as the objects themselves. Trading relationships were inherited through kinship lines and were maintained through ceremonial obligations that could span multiple generations. The act of exchange wasn't just commercial, but was deeply ritual, creating bonds between individuals and communities that transcended simple material transactions. The knowledge systems that guided these complex social arrangements had reached levels of sophistication that rivaled anything developed by literate civilizations. The kinship rules that determined marriage partners, ceremonial roles, and resource rights created networks of relationship that could coordinate activities across vast territories while preventing conflicts that might arise from competing claims or unclear obligations. The legal traditions that governed dispute resolution had evolved into elaborate systems that could address every conceivable form of conflict while maintaining community harmony. These weren't written codes, but were complex bodies of precedent and procedure that were preserved in the memories of specialist legal practitioners and transmitted through formal training programs that could last for decades. The conflict resolution ceremonies that implemented these legal traditions were sophisticated therapeutic processes that addressed not just the immediate dispute, but the underlying social tensions that might have contributed to the problem. These processes often involved ritual combat, formal exchanges of grievances, and symbolic acts of reconciliation that allowed all parties to maintain their dignity while restoring community peace. The leadership structures that guided these legal and ceremonial activities weren't based on hereditary privilege or coercive authority, but on demonstrated wisdom and community recognition. Elders who had shown their knowledge, judgment, and commitment to collective welfare over many years provided guidance and direction. But important decisions were made through extended consultation processes that ensured broad consensus. The educational systems that prepared young people for adult responsibilities had become increasingly sophisticated and comprehensive. Children learned not just practical skills, but complex philosophical frameworks, detailed ecological knowledge, intricate social protocols, and profound spiritual insights. The training required to become a fully initiated adult could last for decades and involved progressively deeper levels of instruction and responsibility. The initiation ceremonies that marked these educational transitions had evolved into transformative experiences that created genuine psychological and spiritual changes in participants. These weren't just symbolic rituals, but were intensive programs that combined physical challenges, periods of isolation, instruction in sacred knowledge, and direct spiritual encounters that fundamentally altered the initiate's understanding of themselves and their place in the world. The gender roles that structured adult life had become increasingly sophisticated and complementary. While men and women often had different primary responsibilities, there was considerable flexibility and overlap in their roles, and both were recognized as essential for the proper functioning of society. The knowledge systems maintained by women were considered equally sacred and important as those preserved by men. The women's traditions that governed plant resources, food processing, child care, and many ceremonial activities represented some of humanity's most sophisticated understanding of botanical science, nutrition, psychology, and social organization. The men's knowledge of hunting, tool-making, astronomy, and other ceremonial responsibilities was equally complex and refined. Both were protected and transmitted through formal systems of instruction that ensured nothing important would be lost. The seasonal calendars that coordinated these various activities had become extraordinarily precise and detailed. Unlike the solar and lunar calendars developed by agricultural societies, Aboriginal seasonal systems were based on careful observation of ecological indicators that varied from region to region. The appearance of particular flowers, the behavior of specific insects, the movements of certain stars, all of these signs were integrated into comprehensive systems that could predict environmental conditions months in advance. The navigation techniques that allowed travel across vast territories had similarly reached remarkable levels of sophistication. In the seemingly featureless expanses of the central deserts, navigators could determine their position and direction by reading subtle changes in vegetation, rock formations, sand patterns, and even the quality of light at different times of day. Their mental maps contained information about water sources, food resources, and travel routes across areas that would challenge modern explorers equipped with electronic instruments. The astronomical knowledge that supported these navigation systems represented one of humanity's most sophisticated pre-telescopic observations of celestial phenomena. Aboriginal astronomers had mapped the movements of stars, planets, and other celestial objects with extraordinary accuracy, creating calendars and navigation systems that could function reliably across vast distances and long periods of time. The Southern Cross served as a celestial timepiece that could indicate both the time of night and the season of the year with remarkable precision. The Coal-Sack Nebula provided markers for seasonal ceremonies and resource availability. The Magellanic Clouds served as navigation guides for long-distance travel. The Milky Way was understood as a celestial river with its own seasonal movements and spiritual associations. But Aboriginal astronomy wasn't just practical science. The movements of celestial objects were integrated into creation stories and ceremonial cycles that gave cosmic significance to human activities. The appearance of particular stars might signal the time for important ceremonies, while the positions of planets could influence decisions about travel, marriage, or resource management. The medicinal knowledge that had accumulated over thousands of years represented another remarkable achievement of Aboriginal science. Traditional healers had identified and learned to use hundreds of medicinal plants, developing techniques for preparation and administration that maximized therapeutic benefits while minimizing harmful side effects. This knowledge was often closely guarded and transmitted only to individuals who had demonstrated both the intellectual capacity and moral character required to use it responsibly. Aboriginal healing traditions weren't limited to herbal medicine, but included sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Healers recognized that individual health was inseparable from community well-being and developed therapeutic practices that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the social and spiritual imbalances that might underlie them. The training required to become a traditional healer was extraordinarily demanding, often requiring decades of apprenticeship under experienced practitioners. Healers needed to understand not just the properties of medicinal plants, but the complex relationships between physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of health. They served as physicians, psychologists, spiritual counselors, and social mediators simultaneously. The food systems that supported these complex societies had reached sustainable levels of productivity that could maintain large populations without depleting the resources on which they depended. The techniques developed for processing plant foods had transformed many inedible or toxic species into nutritious staples that provided complete nutrition from locally available resources. The methods for preparing cycad nuts, for example, required removing deadly toxins through complex sequences of grinding, leaching, and fermentation that took weeks to complete properly. The knowledge of how to do this safely was carefully guarded and transmitted through formal instruction, as mistakes could prove fatal. Similar techniques existed for dozens of other plant foods, each requiring specialized knowledge and careful attention to detail. The hunting technologies that complemented these plant foods had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication and efficiency. The spear throwers that could double the range and accuracy of thrown weapons, the boomerangs that could fly in curved paths and return to their throwers, the fish traps that could channel entire schools into holding areas. All of these innovations represented the culmination of thousands of years of experimentation and refinement. The fire management techniques that shaped entire landscapes had become perhaps the most sophisticated environmental management system ever developed by human societies. Aboriginal peoples could control precisely which plants would regenerate after burning, which areas would become grassland, and which would remain forest. How to create complex mosaics of vegetation at different stages of succession that maximized both biodiversity and resource availability. This wasn't random burning, but was precision landscape management that required intimate knowledge of plant ecology, animal behavior, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles. Different areas were burned at different times of year and at different intervals, creating patchworks of vegetation that prevented catastrophic wildfires while maintaining optimal conditions for both wildlife and human communities. The social mechanisms that coordinated these landscape-scale management activities were equally sophisticated. Information about environmental conditions, resource availability, and management needs was shared through networks that connected communities across vast distances. Decisions about when and where to burn were made through consultation processes that could involve groups separated by hundreds of kilometers. The artistic traditions that flourished within this mature civilization continued to evolve and develop new forms of expression while maintaining connection to ancestral foundations. Regional styles had become increasingly distinctive and sophisticated, with each area developing unique approaches to color, composition, and symbolic content, while sharing underlying structural principles that revealed their common origins. The techniques for creating permanent artworks had reached remarkable levels of refinement. Pigments were prepared using methods that could maintain their colors for thousands of years in challenging environmental conditions. Application techniques allowed for extraordinary precision and detail. Surface preparation methods ensured that images would remain visible and meaningful across countless generations. The symbolic systems encoded in these artworks had become increasingly complex and multi-layered. A single image might simultaneously tell a creation story, provide a map of local resources, encode kinship relationships, and serve as a mnemonic device for remembering ceremonial obligations. The ability to read these multiple meanings correctly required years of training and cultural knowledge. The oral literature traditions that preserved the cultural wisdom of these communities represented perhaps humanity's greatest achievement in non-written information storage and transmission. Epic narratives that could take weeks to perform contain detailed historical records, geographical information, legal precedents, ecological knowledge, and spiritual teachings, all woven together in memorable narrative forms. The techniques developed for preserving this oral literature were as sophisticated as any writing system. Stories were structured using mnemonic devices that made them virtually impossible to forget. Repetitive patterns, rhythmic elements, and emotional content embedded information in multiple layers of memory. The training required to become a keeper of oral tradition was rigorous and lengthy, often requiring decades of apprenticeship and practice. The languages that carried these oral traditions represented extraordinary diversity and sophistication. With over 250 distinct languages across the continent, Australia had achieved more linguistic diversity than any other region of comparable size. Each language was perfectly adapted to its particular environment and cultural context, with vocabularies and grammatical structures that reflected specialized knowledge and local priorities. The poetic traditions that flourished in these languages created some of the world's most sophisticated verse forms. Complex rhythmic patterns, intricate sound relationships, and symbolic imagery could convey multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. The aesthetic principles that guided these poetic traditions emphasized suggestion over explicit statement, creating works that revealed new meanings with each hearing. As this magnificent civilization reached its full flowering, the continent supported communities that had achieved perhaps the most sustainable relationship with their environment that humanity had ever accomplished. The population levels were carefully maintained at levels that allowed for both individual fulfillment and collective prosperity without straining the natural systems that supported all life. The technologies they had developed required no external energy sources beyond human muscle power, and produced no waste that couldn't be recycled by natural processes. The social systems they had established could coordinate activities across continental distances while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. The spiritual traditions they had developed provided frameworks for understanding existence that integrated scientific observation with aesthetic appreciation and ethical guidance. The knowledge systems they had created contained more practical information about their environments than most modern libraries. Yet it was all preserved in human memory and transmitted through story, song, and ceremony. The artistic achievements they had accomplished created works of lasting beauty that continue to inspire contemporary creators. The social innovations they had developed offered solutions to fundamental problems of human organization that remain relevant today. This was the extraordinary world that Aboriginal peoples had created through 65,000 years of careful observation, patient experimentation, and profound spiritual development. It was a civilization that had solved the fundamental challenge of human existence: how to live well on a finite planet without destroying the systems that sustain life. They had achieved this not through domination of nature, but through partnership with it. Not through accumulation of material wealth, but through cultivation of wisdom and beauty. The Australia they inhabited was not an empty wilderness waiting for development, but was a carefully tended landscape shaped by thousands of generations of human wisdom and care. Every waterhole had its guardian spirits. Every mountain had its creation story. Every stretch of coastline had its seasonal ceremonies. The entire continent had become a sacred text written in stone and soil, in the movements of animals and the flowering of plants, in the flow of rivers and the rhythm of seasons. As you continue your journey into restful sleep, let your mind wander through this ancient landscape, where every feature tells a story. Every season brings its ceremonies. Every dawn awakens the eternal dreamtime that flows through all existence. In the gentle darkness of approaching dreams, the ancestral beings continue their creative work, singing the world into being with voices that echo across the vastness of time and space, connecting past and future in the eternal present of the dreaming mind. The great waters that had protected this ancient continent for so long began to whisper of change in their eternal rhythms. Currents that had carried the same seasonal patterns for countless generations now bore new scents, new sounds, strange disturbances that the coastal peoples noticed in the behavior of seabirds and the timing of fish runs. The elders, those keepers of deep memory, began to speak more frequently of the prophecies embedded in the oldest creation stories, narratives that spoke of visitors from beyond the curved edge of the world. In these final centuries before transformation, Aboriginal communities had achieved something that seemed almost miraculous in its completeness. The balance they had struck between human need and natural abundance had created a form of civilization that could theoretically continue forever without depleting the resources upon which it depended. Children born into this mature system inherited not just survival skills, but profound wisdom about how to live in harmony with forces far greater than themselves. The seasonal ceremonies that marked the passage of time had evolved into spectacular celebrations of existence itself. When the first rains of the wet season arrived in the tropical north, communities would gather to perform dances that had been refined over thousands of years. Movements that captured the joy of renewal, the gratitude for abundance, the recognition that all life participated in cycles of death and rebirth that connected the smallest insects to the most distant stars. These weren't simply cultural events, but were sophisticated educational experiences that transmitted essential knowledge while celebrating the beauty and mystery of existence. Young people learned not just when to expect certain plants to flower or particular animals to breed, but how to read the subtle signs that preceded these changes, how to prepare for variations in timing, how to adapt when conditions didn't match expectations. The sacred sites that anchored these seasonal celebrations had become increasingly elaborate over the millennia. What might have begun as simple camping places near reliable water sources had evolved into complex ceremonial centers that served as focal points for communities scattered across territories larger than many modern nations. These sites contained not just physical structures, but layers of meaning that connected local activities to continental patterns and cosmic rhythms. The wisdom keepers who maintained these sacred places carried responsibilities that spanned multiple lifetimes. They preserved not just the stories associated with particular locations, but the precise protocols for approaching them, the specific ceremonies required to maintain their spiritual power, the seasonal timing that governed when different activities could take place. This knowledge was so detailed and interconnected that losing even small portions could disrupt practices that had continued unchanged for hundreds of generations. The artistic traditions that flourished around these sacred centers represented humanity's longest continuous creative heritage. Rock art galleries contained works spanning tens of thousands of years, creating visual libraries that recorded not just aesthetic preferences, but practical knowledge, spiritual insights, and cultural innovations across countless generations. The techniques for creating these lasting images had been refined to extraordinary levels of sophistication. Artists had learned to read rock surfaces like texts, understanding which types of stone would accept different pigments, how to prepare surfaces for maximum adhesion, which locations would protect images from weathering while remaining accessible for viewing and renewal. The pigments themselves were prepared using methods that could maintain their intensity for millennia, with different colors carrying specific symbolic meanings that connected local images to continental patterns of belief and practice. The symbolic systems encoded in these artworks had become increasingly complex and multi-layered over time. Master artists could create images that function simultaneously as maps, genealogies, legal documents, astronomical charts, and spiritual teachings. The ability to read these multiple meanings correctly required years of training that began in childhood and continued throughout life, with different levels of interpretation revealed as individuals progressed through various stages of initiation and responsibility. The musical traditions that accompanied these visual arts had similarly evolved into sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting vast amounts of cultural information. Song cycles that took weeks to perform in their entirety contained detailed geographical knowledge, historical records, legal precedents, ecological observations, and spiritual teachings, all woven together in melodic forms that made them virtually impossible to forget. The instruments used in these performances had been refined through countless generations of experimentation. The didgeridoo, with its deep, resonant tones, had become not just a musical instrument, but a technology for altering consciousness, creating meditative states that facilitated spiritual communication and ceremonial transformation. Different regions had developed their own distinctive instruments and playing techniques, creating rich diversity within the broader patterns of Aboriginal musical expression. The languages that carried these oral traditions represented one of humanity's greatest achievements in cultural diversity. With over 250 distinct languages across the continent, Aboriginal Australia had developed more linguistic variety than any other region of comparable size. Each language was perfectly adapted to its particular environment and cultural context, with vocabularies that reflected specialized knowledge and grammatical structures that encoded relationships between speakers, landscape, and spiritual obligations. The storytelling traditions preserved in these languages had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication and beauty. Epic narratives combined entertainment with education, weaving practical information into compelling stories that could hold listeners' attention for hours while transmitting essential knowledge. The techniques used to structure these stories made them resistant to corruption over time, with built-in checking mechanisms that would alert listeners if details were changed or omitted. The social systems that governed these complex cultural achievements had evolved into forms of organization that could coordinate activities across continental distances while maintaining flexibility to adapt to local conditions and changing circumstances. The kinship networks that determined marriage partners, ceremonial roles, and resource rights created webs of relationship that connected every individual to hundreds of others across multiple generations and vast territories. These kinship systems weren't just social arrangements, but were sophisticated technologies for managing genetic diversity, preventing conflict, sharing resources, and transmitting knowledge. The rules that governed them were so complex that learning one's proper relationships and obligations required years of study, yet they functioned so smoothly that most interactions followed predictable patterns that strengthened rather than strained community bonds. The leadership structures that guided these communities weren't based on hereditary privilege or coercive authority, but on demonstrated wisdom and community recognition. Elders who had proven their knowledge, judgment, and commitment to collective welfare over many years provided guidance and direction. But important decisions emerged through extended consultation processes that ensured broad consensus and shared commitment to chosen courses of action. The educational systems that prepared young people for adult responsibilities had become comprehensive programs that combined practical training with spiritual development, intellectual challenge with character formation. Children learned not just how to perform specific tasks, but how to think about problems, how to read environmental conditions, how to navigate social relationships, how to maintain proper connections with spiritual forces that influenced every aspect of existence. The technologies that supported these educational achievements were perfectly adapted to their purposes and environments. Tools were designed not just for efficiency, but for durability, repairability, and integration with natural systems. The materials used were locally available and renewable. The manufacturing processes required no external energy sources, and the finished products could be recycled completely when they were no longer needed. The food systems that sustained these communities represented perhaps the most sustainable approach to nutrition that human societies had ever developed. Techniques for processing plant foods had transformed potentially toxic species into nutritious staples, while hunting and fishing practices maintained animal populations at optimal levels for both ecological health and human harvest. The fire management systems that shaped entire landscapes had become the most sophisticated environmental management technology in human history. Aboriginal peoples could control precisely which plants would regenerate after burning, creating complex mosaics of vegetation that maximized biodiversity while providing optimal conditions for both wildlife and human communities. The medicinal knowledge that had accumulated over thousands of years included understanding of hundreds of therapeutic plants and sophisticated techniques for treating not just physical ailments, but psychological and social disorders. Traditional healers served simultaneously as physicians, counselors, and spiritual guides, addressing health as a complex interaction between individual well-being and community harmony. The astronomical observations that guided navigation and seasonal planning had achieved remarkable accuracy and detail. Aboriginal astronomers had mapped celestial movements with precision that allowed them to predict seasonal changes, navigate across vast distances, and coordinate ceremonial activities across continental scales of space and time. As this magnificent civilization reached its full expression, the communities scattered across the continent weren't isolated fragments, but were connected through invisible networks of relationship that created unity within diversity. The trade routes that carried precious materials across thousands of kilometers weren't just economic arrangements, but were pathways of cultural exchange that maintained continental-scale connections between local traditions. The seasonal gatherings that brought together communities from vast territories weren't just social events, but were sophisticated conferences where knowledge was shared, innovations were discussed, and collective decisions were made about resource management across entire bioregions. These gatherings created opportunities for young people to learn from elders they might never meet again, for specialists to exchange techniques and insights, for communities to coordinate activities that affected regions far beyond their immediate territories. The ceremonial cycles that structured these gatherings had evolved into spectacular celebrations that engaged every aspect of human creativity and spiritual understanding. Participants painted their bodies with intricate designs that encoded genealogical relationships and spiritual obligations, performed dances that recreated creation stories while demonstrating practical techniques, sang songs that preserved historical events while teaching navigation routes and resource locations. The beauty and complexity of these ceremonies impressed even the most sophisticated observers, combining artistic achievement with educational content in ways that satisfied aesthetic sensibilities while transmitting essential cultural information. The coordination required to organize such events across vast distances and diverse communities demonstrated organizational capabilities that rivaled anything achieved by literate civilizations. The spiritual understanding that unified all these achievements provided frameworks for comprehending existence that integrated scientific observation with aesthetic appreciation and ethical guidance. The Dreamtime concept of reality offered explanations for everything from geological processes to social relationships, all expressed in narrative forms that were both intellectually satisfying and emotionally meaningful. This understanding recognized no separation between sacred and secular, between spiritual and practical, between individual and community. Every activity was embedded in networks of relationship that connected human actions to natural processes, personal choices to collective consequences, present decisions to ancestral wisdom and future possibilities. The environmental management practices that emerged from this understanding had transformed the entire continent into a carefully tended landscape that supported maximum diversity of life while providing sustainable abundance for human communities. This wasn't wilderness preservation, but was active management that enhanced natural productivity while maintaining ecological balance. As the final centuries of isolation drew to a close, Aboriginal Australia had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had created a form of civilization that was simultaneously highly sophisticated and completely sustainable, technologically advanced and spiritually profound, socially complex and environmentally harmonious. The knowledge systems they had developed contained more practical information about their environments than most modern libraries. Yet it was all preserved in human memory and transmitted through story, song, and ceremony. The technologies they had created were perfectly adapted to their purposes and produced no waste that couldn't be recycled by natural processes. The social systems they had established could coordinate activities across continental distances while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. The spiritual traditions they had developed provided complete frameworks for understanding existence that remained relevant to every aspect of daily life. This extraordinary achievement represented not just survival but fulfillment, not just adaptation but transcendence. Aboriginal peoples had solved the fundamental challenge of human existence by learning to live as conscious participants in the ongoing creation of the world, rather than as separate beings struggling against hostile forces. In the gentle rhythm of your breathing as sleep approaches, feel the connection to this ancient wisdom that flows like underground streams through all human consciousness. The stories that were shared around countless campfires under southern stars continue their eternal journey, carrying the dreams of the ancestors into the dreams of generations yet to come. The land itself remembers every ceremony, every song, every sacred footprint that connected human hearts to the beating heart of the living earth. As your eyes close and your mind settles into the peaceful darkness of rest, the eternal Dreamtime continues its creative work, weaving past and future into the timeless present where all stories live forever, where all wisdom remains available to those who know how to listen, where the ancient voices of the first peoples continue to sing the world into being with love, with reverence, with the deep knowing that we are all part of one dreaming, one story, one sacred journey that began when time itself was young and continues still in the quiet moments when consciousness touches the infinite mystery that connects all things.